Welcome everyone again as we move on to our next session today, which is the exclusive presentation on advancing learning in the new normal and beyond by Philip Murray, who is the Regional Vice President Asia from Blackboard. I welcome you, sir, for the session today, and you can please proceed with the session now, and we will again come back with a few questionnaires as along your process.
Pooja, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the World Education Forum for allowing us to present today. So, shall we just jump straight in, shall we? Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Philip Murray, and as I've been introduced, but when we sort of start talking about this new normal, I thought it might be useful, or perhaps to set some context about what has actually been going on, not just from the institution's perspective and the schools and the universities and colleges around the world, but also what perhaps has been happening behind the scenes, stuff that not everybody gets to see and perhaps in some cases doesn't always get to be heard about on TV or in the media. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what's going on there as well to help set some context about this new normal. But again, as we see this idea for the technology and how it's being applied, it's important for us to be able to set out the context of this and why it is that it's so important, because it does cover not just students and educators, but also families, people who are supporting their kids going to school, people who are supporting, maybe parents are returning to school, they're supporting their husband or their wife who is choosing to return to education, and of course how that impacts not just them today, but how do we see that applying for tomorrow as well? So in just a quick screenshot, one of the things we were considering, of course, as we continue to build our technologies out over the last 18 years since we were founded, there's never been a more dramatic change in how education and technology have merged together than from the start of 2020. I know that you look at some of these numbers here and you see how perhaps they look quite dramatic. So I'm just going to pick a couple of them first, and this will give a little bit of insight to what we'll speak about in a few minutes. But when we just look at institutions that have relied on Blackboard just for their own education, the amount of students, for example, who have relied on the LMS, whether via the app or via, of course, the desktop, it has increased by over 400% in daily usage. Now, you might think 400%, that doesn't sound a lot. Well, let's keep in context that a student would normally access an LMS to submit an assignment, to check their grade, or of course to look at what classes they have coming up. And they might do that for maybe an hour or two a day between attending face-to-face sessions. So what we're finding is, of course, that students are not just using their LMS on their mobile phone or their laptop for 2 hours a day. Now they're referring to it for the whole day. So it is literally from 2 hours to 8 hours a day, students are relying on the education technology to allow them to keep informed, keep sharing, and of course, keep engaged with their colleagues and friends. Another one that we saw was a 4,800% increase in the use of our virtual classrooms. Well, this sounds quite obvious. As people move from a face-to-face over to a technology to help them there. But of course, looking at a lot of these increases, these weren't gradual increases. These increases literally occurred over a 2 to 4 week period, where we moved from perhaps 10 million students a day that were relying on our virtual classrooms to almost all students that were leveraging our technology platforms, 100 million students. So these expansions of the requirement for our technology platforms behind the scenes resulted in these sorts of enormous increases. But the last one I'll touch on now, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more in detail, is of course the requirement as institutions looked to third parties to bring on board more capabilities to help enrich where perhaps traditionally they might have relied on a course book, they might have relied on a handout, they might have relied on some in-class resource. They were now a course that's not available, from the face-to-face to the online course. So they looked for third-party tools that could help integrate quickly, seamlessly, and of course effectively, directly to improve the quality of what they were doing. In and of themselves, each of these elements is fine, but they act in isolation. So what I wanted to talk about today is how do we see a number of these technologies that are bringing these dramatic changes and actually bringing them together into something that's a much more cohesive learning platform, a much more cohesive ecology, if you would. And this is where we see this sort of life cycle, if you would, where it's not just about an institution looking to recruit and retain students. It is a critical part of any institution, but of course, having something that is integrated that allows you as an institution to go from recruiting a student, finding out who is best to actually come and join your university, doing your due diligence and assessment, but then also once they're with you, how do you identify them and retain them? Obviously, once a student leaves, for whatever reason that might be, during their degree or diploma program, you can't replace that student in the same course at the same time. It's just not possible. So identifying a student who might be what we call at risk of dropping out or leaving, of course, is a critical part of any integration. And that's part of where we see this whole ecosystem, identifying those who are at need. Perhaps the more traditional part of the offering is then when we're looking at it and saying, well, what about just the pure digital teaching and learning resources? Just the pure ones, submitting an assignment, undertaking a course, sitting an exam, perhaps some of the more creating a curriculum, building a course. So these sorts of traditional elements that come from the digital teaching and learning part of it are ones that many of us are quite familiar with as well. But for many institutions, this is a standalone part of their business. This is something that they need to go off and acquire and undertake themselves and then bring it back and integrate it. But here, as we continue to move into this next generation learning, it's also a learning environment. Of course, it becomes critical because then we have the issues of inclusivity and accessibility. So once we've created content, once we've built that out, once we've made it available, how do we make sure that everybody has access to this? Now, not every student is going to be happy reading just a pure text-based document. Many of them prefer to have the audio version, to listen as though they're sitting in a class and participating in real time. But that gives them the option. So where you have content that is developed, it is almost immediately transferable and translatable into multiple languages, different formats, and of course, in some cases, creating a text file into an audio version so that a student can listen to it easily and absorb it in a more effective way. So that gives them that capability too. But again, this next generation learning environment does look at how do we bring these elements together. Student support. Again, another critical element of the next generation learning is, of course, saying, well, how do we help students? How do we support students more effectively? Now, it's not the same as recruiting and retention. This has a very finite element. Once a student is recruited versus the retention of a student. Student support can be across the student's life cycle. They, of course, might be looking for assistance when it comes to selecting a course or a program. They might be having some challenges, emotional challenges. I'm sure many of us recall when we were younger, of course, everything was, it's very exciting, very new, and of course, in some cases, a little bit overwhelming. So having those sort of resources, that emotional stability resources available for a student as well, but also helping us find out who they are so we can outreach and assist them in an effective way. And we then get to see some of the other elements too. How do we view these? So once we have this capability of a digital teaching and learning platform that's inclusive and accessible to all, that is available to all students, and of course we create a robust and rich environment for a student to participate. We then need to understand, well, how is that all of those elements coming together to improve the institution's capabilities overall? And that's where we see the role of educational insights. The data-driven capabilities that institutions look for to base their decisions on hard information. This data is not to replace decision-making, of course not, but it does help put some numbers behind a decision. It does help when it comes to looking for predictive capabilities. What is going to happen in the next semester or 2 semesters? What has happened historically? How do I back that up so that it's not people just, unfortunately, in some cases, guesstimating what happened? I think maybe last semester we did this and we had this result. Well, having that insight, that educational insight that is based on hard data, that is replicable and is provable, again, helps an institution determine not just their own capabilities, but of course, in some cases, comparing across institutions, between faculties, and of course, across regions. Because again, many of the times that institutions are engaged in a ranking, they look for hard, consistent data to then present on their case. And that's where educational insights comes from, that data tool set that is available, again, from a next generation learning environment. And all of this is great. We've seen the capabilities for students. We've seen some of the technologies that are available, educational insights for leadership as well. But how do we also help academics? And that is a critical part of it. For many institutions at the start of 2020, when of course there was a dramatic change from face-to-face to fully online, or in some cases a hybrid model, academic effectiveness was paramount. We were asking a lot of faculty members to move what they had traditionally taught, how they had taught it, and in some cases had taught it for many semesters, over to a completely new paradigm, and helping them do that. And the academic effectiveness then had to come into play. What resources can I provide? Is there a community of support that they can call on? Because many of the faculty members would be experts in their field, but might not necessarily be experts when it comes to building an online program. So that's where the academic effectiveness comes into it. How do we bring those elements together so that we can help and provide templates, easy to migrate, and really ensure that students have a rich and engaging capability? But then we also look at some other critical parts. And of course, as I mentioned earlier at the second slide, or the third slide, sorry, the third slide was where we were looking at the rich partner capabilities and ecosystem, where institutions were looking at, well, how do I replace what I traditionally used as hard copy content with rich and engaging online resources that students can use? That's where the partnerships come into it. How can they seamlessly be connected into this ecosystem? How can they be shared quickly with all, or with some, depending on what it is that is considered appropriate? And of course, making it available quickly, simply, easily using APIs or LTIs. And that's where the richness of the environment can come in, because it's not just about content. It might be helping students in academic effectiveness, in anti-plagiarism, or as we call it, authenticity checking. How do we make sure that they have access to great video content, whether it's from YouTube or other resources? And of course, how do we make sure that they've got support for mentoring to help in other ways that students perhaps might feel somewhat isolated, but there are some great resources that are out there in the partner communities so that they can help when it comes to the social well-being and the capabilities for students and to keep them engaged. And then finally, it's not just about the success part of it. It's not just about the technology part. It's also, how does it continue to flow? How do we continue to see the capabilities and the ongoing support and services that help enrich this next generation learning environment? So all of these come together as what we refer to as an education technology platform. It's modeled very closely on this next generation learning environment, NGLE. But again, obviously it's a little bit unique to Blackboard because we can cover all of the elements and not just individual capabilities as well. So there's this smooth transition from one requirement to the next. There's no need to log in and out of applications, different apps, different capabilities, different platforms. All of these things come together seamlessly. And that's what we really consider towards the new normal, is creating a consistent and holistic solution that can be added to on demand when you need it, where you need it. But all of this is great. Having this great education technology platform, how does it fit together with what it is we're trying to do? Well, of course, here in India, one of the major initiatives that is propelling forward many Indian educational providers is looking at how do we create this new education policy, this capability of introducing a lot of technology, new platforms, providing guidance and assistance for faculty and teachers, and also propelling towards a global standard that we have seen happen in other parts of the world, and that certainly India can meet and in many cases will achieve and exceed, of course. But that is having that platform available. That new education policy's goal is to help drive towards that. And the education technology that we were talking about is one of the ways that it can be achieved. But this is all great. You could say, okay, Philip, this sounds fantastic. Gosh, but it must take ages to do. I couldn't imagine us doing this in any time frame that makes sense for our business, particularly when we were looking at problems we were facing in 2020. For many institutions, they were having to go from fully face-to-face to fully online, literally in a matter of days. So one of the things that we also looked at, and how do we leverage this, is what we call the rapid implementation. And this is where you would normally see, if anybody has been involved in a technology migration, introducing a brand new platform, whether or not it's a CRM, or it could be an LMS, or any of the other major technology platforms introduced into an institution, there is this ongoing project management goal, which is to set these criteria and to meet and review them as you go. And this is where it can take months for a major deployment to be undertaken. To us, that just wasn't possible. Clients weren't coming to us and saying, I'm going to close my institution for 6 months while we introduce this, right? They're not coming to us and saying, thank you very much, Blackboard, this is exactly what we need, but how are we going to do it? You've got, in some cases, 30 days. So this is where we saw this capability and this streamlining of everything that we were doing. When we looked at the education platform and all of the technologies that are attached to it, we really needed to trim that down. How do we provide 30 days to success? So rather than covering every single element in depth, we came up with this model, which was what we call the rapid implementation plan. Kind of self-explanatory, but it really meant that from the date of commitment to a go live date, where students are logged on, they're using many of the capabilities straight away, they are feeling confident, faculty are involved, leadership understands. It was literally a 30-day model. Now, 30 days sounds quite a bit, but if you've ever done a technology deployment, I'm sure you realize that 30 days is crazily short. So this is how we looked at it. And it's not just me talking about it, because there are institutions here in India that have used that model to help achieve these goals. So Chandigarh University relied on this rapid implementation plan. 4 weeks they gave us to deploy fully all of their LMS plus their virtual classrooms, bring on board the analytics and the tool sets for decision making, and they gave us 4 weeks to do it. And it was successful. Right, so Chandigarh University. GNA came to us with an even tighter timeline. It wasn't 30 days, it was 14 days, 2 weeks to do this. Now, obviously, you can't do the same amount of work in half the time and making sure that it's effective. So we needed some customization, some perhaps refining of how we were delivering this. And that was how we came up with a 14-day plan. Literally from the date they said, yes, we're going to do this, to the date we said we are fully online, ready to go, and that was 2 weeks. But other institutions in India, of course, benefited from what we've brought to the table with the partnerships, the next generation learning environment, and again, making sure that everybody has those capabilities available to them on demand, when they need it, where they need it as well. So this is how we see this idea of this new normal, leveraging on the requirements for the next generation learning environment, which is not just something that Blackboard came up with. This is something that institutions around the world and global standards have been created about. So we see this as being a critical part of how this new normal will move forward. Everything comes together in an ecosystem, completely integrated, capable right from the word go, and with a time frame that is manageable and straight to the point and delivers on the result. So to that, I wanted to thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have as well.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time and this wonderful presentation which you just gave. We are having one question from the audience, that is, how does hybrid learning look like post-pandemic situation? If you could just tell a little bit about the blending learning situation which we'll be having.
No problem. So I guess one of the key challenges have been is, what is it that's okay for us to replace from traditional face-to-face versus what do we need to have in fully as an online, what benefits us in an online capability. So this post-pandemic model, we believe, will actually include a lot of what we've already seen has been delivered in 2020 and now in 2021, that will remain. But of course, the value of it also comes about from extracting the high quality teaching capabilities that we have with thousands of institutions around the world, hundreds of millions of students, hundreds of thousands of faculty and teachers, and really leveraging that capability more effectively. So it's not just about putting stuff online, no. There is always and must always be a role for high quality education and high quality engagement, and that social interaction that perhaps we've seen has struggled in the last year because people have been stuck at home or home-based learned. So again, that provides us with this capability. Post-pandemic, we see it continuing. Will it streamline? Will there be some adjustments? Of course. Some institutions will be quite happy to return to what they had in the past, and they will be, they will completely be happy with that. That was how they were. Others, of course, have looked at it on the other end of the scale and said, I like where I am now. Students are facilitated. They are feeling they're getting real value out of this, and I'd like to continue. But then there's this wide group in the middle who are no longer want to remove or go back to where they were, but they're not quite ready to go fully online. There's this large group in the middle, the 80%, if you would, at the normal distribution. They will continue to look at ways they can leverage both online, offline, and of course, a rich ecosystem of technology to provide them those benefits too. So we see that as a normal distribution. Perhaps last year, we kind of moved that distribution a little bit to the more online. That was certainly fair. Where do we see it? Perhaps coming back a little bit more, but the bulk of users will still, and the bulk of institutions will still have a very robust offering, which will be online.
Absolutely, sir. It is so correctly said by you. We would, as we are just having some time constraint for, we have to move on to our next presentation today. We would like to present you a speaker certificate for presenting this beautiful presentation. Mr. Philip Murray, thank you so much, sir, for being with us today at the World Education Summit.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. I look forward to attending the other sessions later.
Absolutely. Please.